Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to be talking about the feeding of milk replacers to dairy beef crossbred heifers, or calves, not heifers, calves. Welcome, Dr. Kurtz. Thanks for being with us today. And of course, as always, if anybody would like to post any questions for Dr. Kurtz as we go through this discussion, feel free to do that there on your screen or in your social media channel if you're joining us through social media. So, welcome, and I'm going to let you get going.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Good to be back another month. If you've been connected with the dairy industry over the last 10 years or so, you know that crossbred beef and dairy crossbreds are becoming more common. And I think this really got started when sex semen came into play, because instead of getting maybe 50% heifers on a dairy farm, you could get 80% or more heifers. And so it led to a glut of heifers. And after a while, I think people said, well, we don't need all these heifers now. So the idea came up to take maybe half the herd, plus or minus, and breed them to beef sires. And these crossbreds came out. I read someplace just recently that something like 80% of the beef semen sold for AI goes now to dairy cows. Of course, there isn't a big market within that industry anyway, because you've got a lot of cow-calf operations. But anyway, that's kind of the background for this. So that means that's another kind of animal to do studies with to figure out how best to feed and manage. And so in this case, we're going to discuss a study done at the University of Minnesota Southern Research and Outreach Center, a calf and heifer research facility at Waseca. That's south of Minneapolis. I've been there because they've been doing studies there for probably 20 some years. They have a good facility. They generally raise calves from some of the area dairy farms, so they deal with heifers. In this case, they were dealing with bull calves, and they picked them up at about 2 to 5 days of age, and they were Holstein Angus crosses. And they had two different milk replacers they were looking at using. One was a 20% protein, 20% fat, and the other was a 24% protein, 24% fat. Now, a little background, and maybe some of you know this. I go back a ways. So in the 1970s, a typical milk replacer was like 22% protein and 10 to 12% fat. Well, then people say, well, it needs to be more fat. And so when you raise the fat, you increase the cost. So they dropped the protein a little bit down to 20. And that's how 2020 came into being. It's, I think, misnamed often as an industry standard. It's like an industry practice, but not really a standard because it doesn't have good nutritional base for making those changes. But those are two milk replacers they were being fed in this case. And then they also had a calf starter, which was texturized. And going back in history on calf starters, in the 70s, most calf starters were texturized because it's really best for the calf for rumen development and function, transition to forage. But when cost became a bigger factor, and texturized calf starters often have molasses applied to the outside, different levels, and its consistency and physical characteristics varies, so it can get sticky or dry or whatever. So as a result, there was a push to uh, have all pelleted calf starters instead of texturized because they cost less. And then that led to what I call a horsepower race. You know, my tractor's got more horsepower than yours. In this case, it was a protein race. So a 16% protein as fed starter is about 18 on a dry matter basis. In this case, it went from 16 to 18 to 20 to 22, and some even greater than that. So that's how that's all kind of evolved, not on a good nutritional basis, but more from a marketing standpoint. So the milk replace or the calf starter they had in this case was supposed to be about an 18%. And then they fed these calves 6 liters and split into 2 feedings a day for 42 days. And then they eliminate one feeding for a week. So that's 49 days. And then they were weaned. And they kept them there for another week at 56 days. And that's always a good practice because then you can see whether there's any carryover effects. But unfortunately, it's not followed very often. So that's kind of the overall protocol for the study. So we can look at the first table. You can see that if you look at the milk replacers, they typically don't have that much moisture if they're sealed well in a bag. So only about not even 4% moisture in the tube. On a as-is basis, or percent of dry matter rather, the 2020 was 20% protein and 20% fat. So it's very close to a 2020 on as-fed basis because only having 3.4% moisture. So that was close, but the 24 was not as close. It was actually a bit lower, 23.5, 23.2. And then you see the other factors. Ash, always look at ash. That's a low level of ash, which is adequate. Look at the calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. Because the reason I look at ash is that sometimes a milk replacer to have a high level of D-lactose whey, which has a very high ash content. So you can find a milk replacer that has about 10% ash. That's usually because of high D-lactose whey included. Now the starter, of course, has more moisture, usually about 10% or 12%. As you see here, about 10%. It was 22.4% protein. Now that seems high, and I think it probably is, because one of the difficulties with sampling a texturized starter is you got the various components. And if you don't get a representative sample, you get a higher percentage of the pellets, you're going to end up with a higher calculated or laboratory analysis. And I think that's probably what happened here. If you go down the list, you see the starch is about 35. Now, some might say that's pretty high. Well, it is high if you have a pelleted starter and you're not feeding any forage because those calves are more likely to be in marginal acidosis. But with a well-texturized starter, 35 to 40% starch is not unusual and not an issue. So now let's look at the figure. It's a very comprehensive figure. So we'll kind of walk through it. The top segment to start with. If you look at the left-hand upper level, that's the body weight. And you see with the 24% protein, 24% fat milk replacer, those calves right away showed a difference, and that difference increased as the time period went out to weaning. And then if you look at right below it, you see the average daily gain, and of course that follows the same pattern. And if anything, again, the daily gain increases some towards the end. So now if we look at the next set of slides, you have hip height. And the hip height, if you got true growth, you should see it increasing over that approximately 2-month period. And it did, so it shadowed the body weight increase, which is typical and normal. And then right below that, you see the dry matter intake. Now, the dry matter intake, of course, is a portion into the milk replacer and the starter. So since they were feeding at a flat level, the milk replacer, you see that intake is flat until the end of 42 days when they cut it in half for a week before full weaning. But you see there's a tendency for the starter intake towards the end, when it's a bigger part of their dry matter intake, for it to be higher on the calves that are in 24 protein, 24 fat. So now if we look at the next two sets of slides, we're looking at the efficiencies. So gain per kilogram of a day, you see there's a tendency, again, if not a statistical difference, for the efficiency to be greater through the first 3 or 4 weeks with the 24 protein, 24 fat milk replacer. Then as you go into the weaning period, it actually drops a bit. And then after they're fully weaned, for that week afterwards, it picks up again. And that's, again, a reason why you should do that. You should have a follow-up period after weaning so you can see this kind of pattern if it develops. Now, the other figures are ratios of, instead of dry matter, it's a ratio of the energy uh, or the protein. And that's similar to what you might expect with the dry matter intakes. And then the very bottom slide on the right is the fecal score. And you see there's really not much difference in the second set of columns. There tend to be some difference there, but otherwise there was no big difference on the fecal scores. So now let's look at the table and see what that looks like. The first thing you'll notice is that the calves on 24 milk replacer were about 5 pounds, 4 pounds greater when they started out the trial. But that was corrected by a covariate analysis, so that's not a bias that you carry over. Now, if you look at the average daily gain in the first 49 days, you see that 2020, the only average a little over a pound. And the 24 about almost a pound and right around a pound and a quarter. And that was a significant increase, significant difference. Now, the question, of course, is how much of that was due to the higher fat, how much was due to the higher protein, and we really don't know in this case. Now, when you look at the overall 56 days, the average daily gain was 1.2 on the 2020 and 1.5 on the other treatment in 24, and that was a significant increase. Now, the milk replacer intake was very similar, not a significant difference. And then let's look at the starter intake. Pre-weaning, they ate less starter with the 2020 than with the 24. Now, that's 0.07, so it's approaching a significant difference in 0.05. Now, that might be surprising a little bit because typically the higher the fat level in the milk replacer and the more energy to get from the milk replacer, the less starter they eat. But that's also can be countered because in this case, those calves on the 24 were gaining more. So it would make sense that if they're bigger, they have more body weight, which they did, that also propels them to eat more of the starter. So you have those two factors that can come into play. If you look at the overall numbers, 1.16 and 1.59, so that was again close to that 0.05 difference. Now, uh, what does this mean? Well, there's a couple of things that struck me. One is I thought these calves would have gained more and eaten more starter, and they didn't. But I've also been in touch with the author, Dr. Isaac Salfer, who gave me the figures to use. And what I found in doing calf studies over the years is sometimes there's a group of calf that don't do well at all across the board. So it's difficult to pick up differences between treatments because their performance is poor. And you can pull out your hair trying to figure out why, and you don't know. On the other hand, sometimes the opposite happens. You have a set of calves that does really well, and you can't figure out why, but it happens periodically. So I think that's probably what happened in this case. For some reason, those calves just didn't do as well. The ones on the 24-24, they did gain about 1.5 pounds overall. So that would approximately double their initial weight at the end of 2 months. And that's generally the kind of goal we have when we're dealing with heifers. And it would pretty much fit with these bull calves at the same time. So that's kind of the summation of this study.
Very good. A reminder, if you have any questions, to post those now for Dr. Kertz. And his column is also posted there in the chat if you want to take a look at that and dig into that more deeply. So, Dr. Kertz, what's the bottom line in all of this? It's always the question we like for you to summarize for us.
Yeah, the bottom line in this case is a little bit murky. The 24-24 calves did do better. It's also because they ate more starter. And to really delve into this, you would have to take the 2021 edition of the dairy cattle nutrient requirements. It's got a young calf model. You can put data in and it will calculate what the results should have been. And so it'd be interesting to take this data, have the individual data, and put them in that model and see how it predicted. And was it primarily the higher protein in the milk replacer, or was it a higher fat or combination that resulted in better performance with those calves?
Very good. Well, thank you today for joining us and sharing your insight. Always great to hear from you.
Thank you.
Likewise, we appreciate all of you tuning in. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format on feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.